I wasn't invited to my grandfather's funeral. I found out from a stranger's Facebook post. When I flew home, heartbroken and furious, I expected grief. Instead, I found my grandmother, my hero, shivering alone on the porch with a suitcase and no keys. My parents had changed the locks, erased her from the house, and called it legal. But this wasn't about law. This was betrayal. Family isn't supposed to discard you when you're no longer useful. My name is Claire Hudson, and I'm about to burn down everything they built. One secret, one lie, and one stolen deed at a time. I found out my grandfather died the same way I found out about most things in my family, by accident. A grainy photo on Facebook, posted by a neighbour I barely remembered, showed a casket, lilies, and my parents standing beside it in stiff black. No call, no message, not even a cold, obligatory text. I stared at the screen for a full minute before the grief caught up and hit me like a truck. I booked a flight home to Maine that night. The plane touched down on a grey morning. The coastal mist clung to everything like a shroud. I hadn't been home in nearly 2 years. Boston kept me busy, or maybe I kept myself busy to avoid them. My job as an architect came with long hours and endless projects, convenient excuses to stay away from the coldness that always radiated from my parents' house. But this was different. Grandpa James was gone, and I owed him a proper goodbye, even if it was too late. Driving into town felt like stepping back in time. The roads hadn't changed, nor had the little shops with their peeling signs and sleepy cats in the windows. But the moment I turned onto Maple Street, my breath caught. There it was, the old Victorian house. White with faded green shutters, it stood like a memory carved into wood and brick. That house raised me, not just sheltered, but raised. My grandparents filled it with warmth when my parents couldn't or wouldn't. I pulled up to the curb, heart racing, expecting silence. But what I saw made me freeze. My grandmother was sitting on the porch steps, alone. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her grey hair wild in the wind. Next to her sat a small, battered suitcase. Her hands trembled around a styrofoam coffee cup, long gone cold. She looked up, squinted, and tried to smile, but her lips quivered. "Claire," she said, her voice brittle. I rushed to her, dropped to my knees. "Grandma, what are you doing out here?" She looked down at her lap. "They told me this wasn't my home anymore." A chill sharper than the air shot through me. "What do you mean? Who told you that?" "Your mother and Charles," she said quietly, refusing to call him your father, like she used to. "After your grandfather passed, they said the will left the house to them. They changed the locks the day after the funeral." I stood up, stunned. The front door behind her had a new digital lock. Gone was the brass keyhole I remembered as a child, the one Grandpa used to open every Sunday after church when we came back with groceries and wildflowers. "They didn't even let me take my things," she added, "just said I should find somewhere else to go." I clenched my fists, vision swimming. "And no one tried to stop them?" She gave a broken shrug. "Who would? They have the papers. People trust papers." I helped her to her feet and led her to my car. She was light, too light, like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Every step she took rattled in my bones like guilt. As I buckled her in and drove toward the nearest inn, my mind spun. Memories tumbled over one another. The garden we planted together when I was 8. The time she stayed up with me all night during a thunderstorm. Her apple pie that won every local fair for 15 years. This woman wasn't just my grandmother. She was the mother I never had. And now she was homeless, not because of war or poverty, but because of family. My family, I glanced over. She had fallen asleep, head resting against the window, her face soft despite the betrayal. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with comfort or quiet mourning. This was war. She woke up at the inn with a faint gasp, the kind you hear when someone's been dreaming of falling. I handed her a glass of warm water, and she stared at it like she wasn't sure what it was for. They said, "It's not mine," she whispered, more to herself than to me. They said, "It's not mine." Her voice was dry and far away, like it had been echoing down a long hallway and barely reached me. She'd been repeating that line since last night. I'd heard it in the car, in the lobby, and again just before she fell asleep. They said it's not mine. The house. The home she'd built with Grandpa James, brick by brick, flower bed by flower bed, not hers. I sat on the edge of the bed and squeezed her hand. It felt papery, fragile. "You don't need to go back there," I said softly. She nodded, but I wasn't sure she heard me. After she fell asleep again, I stepped out into the hall to breathe. The inn smelled of old carpet and lemon cleaner. I stood by the vending machine and stared at the peeling wallpaper, trying to reconcile the image of my once vibrant grandmother with the woman curled up under 2 thin blankets. It hit me then, not just sadness, but rage. A deep, rattling fury I hadn't felt since the day I learned my parents considered me the problem child. But this wasn't teenage rebellion anymore. This was institutional cruelty, masquerading as inheritance law. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. I tried again, voicemail. So I did the next best thing. I drove back to the old house. The new digital lock blinked red when I pressed the doorbell. Charles answered. He looked older than I remembered, but not in a fragile way. Just tired, polished in that politician-adjacent way he always had. My mother appeared behind him, her lips already pinched. "Claire," she said flatly, "we weren't expecting—" "You locked Grandma out of her own house," I snapped. My mother didn't blink. "It was in the will. The property's in our name now. She was given notice. She didn't even know when the funeral was. We assumed you'd tell her," she said, shifting blame without hesitation. I laughed, bitter and loud. "You didn't even call me." "You made it clear years ago that you didn't want to be part of this family," she said, voice sharp. "Why would we include you in something this sensitive?" That one landed like a slap. I stood there, absorbing it, and then twist. Behind her, something moved. A small figure peeked around the corner. A girl no older than 10, with thick glasses and a sketch pad in her hand. My mother turned, startled. "Anna, go back upstairs." But she didn't. She looked at me, then at my mother. Then she walked over and held out her sketch pad. I looked down. It was a drawing of my grandmother, sitting on the porch, crying. "She said you hurt her," the girl said. Silence. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Charles stepped forward, but stopped himself. I crouched down. "What's your name?" "Anna. I live next door now. I used to visit the garden. Evelyn let me pick mint." I smiled, my throat tight. "She remembers you." Anna nodded. "She cries a lot now." I turned to my mother. "Even a child can see what you did." Then I stood and left. Back at the inn, I slipped into the room and saw Grandma staring at the ceiling. "They said it's not mine," she whispered again. I sat beside her, pulled out the sketch Anna gave me, and placed it in her hands. She stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in days, she cried. Not the empty, distant kind, but deep, real sobs. From the part of her still trying to believe this wasn't a nightmare. And I knew this was more than losing a house. It was losing everything that ever felt like home. I didn't sleep that night, The inn's heater rattled like it had asthma, and every creak of the floorboards reminded me of the old house. Of Grandma Evelyn climbing the stairs with a basket of laundry, humming some song from the 1940s. Now she was in the next room, curled into herself like she was trying to disappear. By morning, I'd made up my mind. We were going back to the house. She didn't argue. She simply put on the same coat, picked up her little suitcase, and followed me like a ghost. At the door, my father answered this time. Charles Mitchell was a lawyer through and through, always calm, always rehearsed. He opened the door just wide enough to make it clear we weren't welcome. "We're not here to fight," I said. "That's good," he replied, voice cold, "because there's nothing left to fight for." Evelyn stepped forward. "Charles, please, just let me take my photo albums. Let me take my James's letters. I won't stay. Just let me have something," he sighed. "You don't understand, Evelyn. This house is no longer yours. Legally, you have no claim." "No claim?" Her voice trembled. "I lived here for 47 years. My mother appeared behind him. Her face was hard, unmoved. "You were never on the deed," she said simply. "The house was always in Dad's name. We had it transferred right after he passed." I blinked. "Transferred? How?" Charles held up a folded document. "This is the new will, signed and notarized 2 months before he passed. It names your mother and I as sole inheritors of the property." I reached out, but he pulled it back. "You can see a copy through legal counsel." "You're really doing this?" I asked, disbelief sour on my tongue. "He wanted it this way," my mother said, and for a second, just a second, I saw her hesitate. "He thought Evelyn would be better cared for elsewhere with professionals." "Professionals?" I said. "Like you. Who left her on the porch with a suitcase?" She looked away. I turned to my grandmother. She was shaking now, but not from the cold. Her lip trembled, and she was gripping her coat sleeve so tightly the knuckles went white. "I want to go," she whispered. I put my arm around her. We're going." We walked back to the car in silence. At the hotel, I got her settled again, turned on the heater, brought her tea. She didn't speak much, just sat by the window, watching grey clouds roll over the coastal town like a tide that never came in. I stepped into the hallway, my phone already ringing. It was Miriam, my best friend in Boston. She was the kind of person who always answered on the first ring, who always said exactly what needed saying, even when it hurt. "I saw the photo," she said. "Is that your grandmother? She looks like she hasn't eaten in days." "She probably hasn't," I said. "They locked her out, took everything." "Jesus, Claire, I want to sue them." A pause. "That's not simple." "I don't care." "You have to find the old will, the one before this update. If she wasn't on the deed or listed as co-owner." "I know," I said, "but I have to do something." "You're not just doing this for her, are you?" Silence. "I mean, I get it." She continued gently. "You were erased too, from that house, that family." Tears stung my eyes. "This is your fight too." I looked back into the room. Evelyn was still by the window, her hand tracing invisible shapes in the air. Like she was remembering where things used to be. The side table, the photo frame, the chair James always sat in. I made a silent promise then. This wouldn't be the end of her story, or mine. 3 days passed before I saw my mother again. I went back to the house, not because I thought she'd changed her mind, but because something inside me refused to let go. I needed answers, even if they came with more wounds. She answered the door alone this time, her hair perfectly set, her lips lined like armour. "What do you want, Claire?" "I want the truth," I said, "and maybe my grandmother's dignity back." She didn't flinch. "You always were dramatic, I stepped inside. She didn't stop me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. She walked toward the kitchen, her heels echoing off the hardwood. "Because this isn't about emotion. It's about protection, responsibility. It's business, not family." Those words froze the air around us. "Try. You're talking about the woman who raised me when you were too busy having meetings and skipping town." She shrugged. People get old. They become liabilities. Your father and I made the responsible choice. By throwing her out. By planning for long-term care. We had a facility lined up, high-end. She would have been well taken care of." "And Grandpa?" Her pause said everything. "He refused, didn't he?" I said. She turned sharply. He didn't understand the burden she'd become. He thought sentiment could substitute structure. I stared at her. "You tried to put her in a home behind his back. She was forgetting things, burning tea kettles, wandering outside at night. She still remembered who I was." Silence. "I saw your daughter," I added. "Anna, sweet girl, talented, must have been hard explaining why Grandma was crying on the porch." Her face twitched. "That child draws everything. Not everything is meant to be captured." "Apparently, neither is love." I stormed out, rage buzzing like static in my fingertips, but I didn't leave, not yet. Something kept pulling me toward the back hallway, the part of the house that always smelled like cinnamon and cedar, where Grandpa used to stoke the fire in winter. I stepped into the den. It had been completely redecorated. Cold, modern prints replaced the old family photos, every corner sterilized, impersonal, except one thing caught my eye. Behind the gas-powered fireplace, behind the low shelf no one ever used, I spotted something odd. A bump under the panelling. I bent down, pulled gently, and a thin wooden frame slid out from behind the slats. A photograph. It was old, faded around the edges. A candid shot of Grandpa and Grandma Evelyn on the porch swing, holding mugs and laughing like the world couldn't touch them. Taped to the back was a scrap of paper, yellowed and creased. My fingers trembled as I peeled it open. It read, "Claire, if you see this, dig deeper. Start with the ledger in the attic. Love, Grandpa." My breath caught. I stared at the words until they blurred. He knew what might happen after he was gone. He knew I'd come looking. My hands tightened around the frame like a lifeline. Back at the inn, I laid the photo and note on the nightstand beside Evelyn. She was half asleep, but when she saw the image, she smiled. A real smile, the kind that softened the room. "He hid that," she murmured, "said it was for safekeeping." "He left a message," I whispered, "for us." She nodded slowly, then reached out and touched my hand. I always knew he'd find a way to help. That night, I didn't dream of court battles or cold stares. I dreamed of attics, of dust motes in sunlight, of pages turning, of truth waiting to be found. The next morning, I was at the county recorder's office, the minute their doors opened. The place smelled of old paper and floor wax. And the clerk at the front desk looked like he hadn't had coffee yet. But I was focused. Grandpa had told me to dig deeper, and I intended to dig until I hit bedrock. "I need property transfer records for 18 Maple Street," I told the clerk, sliding my ID across the counter. He raised an eyebrow, typing with deliberate slowness. "Mitchell House?" "Yes." He nodded, then disappeared into a back room. I tapped my fingers on the chipped laminate as the minutes dragged. When he returned, he set down a thin manila folder. "That's what we've got on file. Mostly digital now, but there's some legacy stuff from the 80s and 90s. I thanked him and carried it to a side table. Flipping through the pages, I found the expected purchase deed from 1974, mortgage releases, small renovation permits. But then something stopped me cold. There was a property transfer recorded just 3 weeks before my grandfather's death. It listed Charles and Margaret Mitchell, my parents, as joint owners. But there was no record of Evelyn Mitchell relinquishing her claim. I frowned, searching the footnotes. Then I saw it. A clause citing power of attorney due to mental incompetence. Dated, signed, backdated. My pulse quickened. If Grandpa had still been alive when this was filed, and I was sure he was, that meant either he had given power of attorney or someone forged the consent. I needed more. I asked the clerk where older wills were archived, and he pointed me toward the probate office 2 blocks down. The November wind stung my cheeks as I walked, but I barely noticed. Inside, the probate receptionist was a kind-eyed woman in her 60s who perked up when I mentioned James Mitchell. "Oh, yes," she said, "wonderful man. He used to bring cookies when he filed documents." I smiled despite myself. "I'm looking for any previous versions of his will." She typed something, then paused. "Well, there was one dated from 4 years ago, but it was superseded by a later version." "Can I see the old one?" She hesitated. "Only if you're named in it." I leaned in. "Please check." She nodded and kept typing. After a moment, she looked up. "Claire Evelyn Mitchell. That's you?" "That's me." She printed the document and slid it across the counter. I scanned the first page. My parents were listed, of course, but so was Evelyn Mitchell, clear as day. My grandmother was to retain lifetime rights to the house, regardless of ownership. Tears blurred the words. "She was protected," I whispered. "Yes, she was," the clerk said gently, "until someone decided otherwise." I clutched the paper like it might disappear. My grandmother hadn't just been tossed aside. She had been erased, deliberately, strategically. And now I had proof. I walked back to the inn with numb fingers and a storm in my chest. Evelyn was awake, sipping chamomile tea, her eyes brighter than they'd been in days. "I found the will," I said, laying the paper in front of her. She squinted, then smiled softly. "That's James's handwriting. He tried to protect you." "I know. But they filed a new one, claimed you weren't competent." She didn't respond, just looked out the window, silent. "I'm going to fight this," I said, "legally." "You don't have to." "Yes," I said firmly, "I do." Because this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about what people could get away with when no one paid attention. About the quiet cruelty hidden behind family dinners and polite smiles. And I was done being polite. That night I returned to the house, not through the front door, but with a flashlight and gloves. The attic window had always been loose, and after years of climbing trees and sneaking cookies from Grandma's pantry, I still knew how to get in without waking a soul. The attic smelled of cedar, dust, and old secrets. I stepped quietly, the floorboards groaning beneath me. Grandpa's workbench sat untouched, jars of screws lined in rows like soldiers. I aimed the flashlight toward the far wall, where the wood changed colour slightly, just near the baseboard. That was the spot. He'd always told me, when something's worth protecting, don't put it where everyone looks. Put it where only someone who remembers would find it. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the seam. There. A notch, just barely raised. I pressed it, and a square of floor gave way with a soft pop. Inside was a metal tin wrapped in plastic. My heart thudded as I opened it. There, beneath a folded cloth, was a single envelope. My name was written on the front in his slanted script, Claire. I sat down cross-legged, hands shaking, and opened the letter. Claire, if you're reading this, I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted. But I know you. You don't walk away from injustice. And what's happened, or what's going to happen, is just that. Your father has been planning for years. He forged more than trust. I found out too late, and by then I was already too tired to fight. But you're not tired. Check the pension accounts, the ones in Evelyn's name. Look for withdrawals from 2021. You'll see what I mean. Use your head. Use the law. Do what's right, not what's easy. That's the granddaughter I know. Love you always, Grandpa. My throat burned as I folded the letter back into its envelope. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood up and quietly replaced the floorboard, hands steady now with purpose. The next morning, I sat in front of my laptop at the inn, Evelyn beside me sipping coffee with both hands. I'd already called the bank, using her authorization, pretending I was helping her review statements. I pulled up the account. Sure enough, the retirement account Grandpa had set up for Evelyn showed multiple large withdrawals over the course of several months, amounts too specific to be accidental. Each one was signed with a shaky digital signature labelled James Mitchell. The dates lined up just months before his death. I clicked further. The receiving bank account was listed under C. Mitchell Legal Services, my father's private account. He had stolen from her with her own husband's name. I turned to Evelyn, who was watching me without asking questions. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. He always wanted power, even over my peace. I took a breath. Grandma, I said, we're not going to confront them yet. That's what they expect. Anger, drama, emotion, but we're going to do this differently. She tilted her head. How? Legally, quietly, permanently. Over the next few hours, I mapped it out. Gather documentation. Property transfers, bank records, Evelyn's original will, file a civil complaint for financial elder abuse, petition the court to freeze assets pending investigation, alert the state's licensing board about possible professional misconduct. My father's legal license would be on the line. Contact a probate lawyer specialising in contested wills. I wasn't just going to get Grandma's house back. I was going to make sure no one else got hurt again. And this time, the family name wouldn't be a shield. It would be a mirror, reflecting every ugly truth. I found Grandpa's old lawyer listed in a dusty phone book Evelyn had kept under her bed. Surprisingly, he was still practicing, semi-retired but sharp as ever. His name was Harold Stein, and he met me in a modest office above a bakery downtown. The room smelled of sugar and legal pads. When I explained who I was, he smiled softly. I remember your grandfather well, he said. Always meticulous, always 2 steps ahead. I think he tried to protect her, I said, sliding the forged documents across the desk. But they got to everything. He scanned the papers, frowning. This reeks. The timing. The signatures, your father's involvement. I want to fight back, I said, not just emotionally, legally, strategically. Harold leaned back. What's your end game? Get her house back, restore her accounts, and make sure they can't do this again to her or anyone. He nodded slowly. Then we start by creating a trust. I blinked. A trust. We transfer any future assets to it anonymously. It becomes the legal owner. It can sue, it can buy, it can hold property, and your name stays far from anything visible. But I don't own anything. Not yet, he said with a glint in his eye, but you're about to. The next week was a blur of forms, signatures, legal jargon, and notarized paperwork. The Evelyn Clare Trust was born, quiet, invisible, untouchable by anyone who didn't know where to look. We gave it a registered agent and ran it through a shell management company to mask the trail. Step 2, acquire the house. This part took finesse. We couldn't go in directly. If my parents caught wind of what I was doing, they'd tie up the property in red tape faster than you could say litigation. So Harold made a call to a former client, an elderly man in real estate who owed him a few favours. Within a week, the man approached my father's firm under a different name and expressed interest in buying the Maple Street house for redevelopment. The offer was generous, more than market value. My parents bit immediately. Greed was their Achilles heel. Within 5 days, the deal was signed. They thought they'd won again, but what they didn't know was that the buyer was simply a front. The funds had come from me, from the trust, and just like that, the house was ours again. I didn't tell Evelyn right away. I wanted to do it right. Not with fanfare or gloating, quietly, dignified, the way she'd always lived. Instead, I stood outside the house alone that night, the old key, copied from memory, cold in my palm. The porch creaked under my feet, like it remembered me. I turned the lock. The door opened. It was empty now, staged for the next owner. But the bones were the same. I stepped inside, breathed in. It still smelled like her, lavender and old wood. That night, I sat in the den where Grandpa used to read. The house was silent, but I could almost hear his voice. Use your head. Use the law. Do what's right. I had. And now the real battle would begin. I showed up at my parents' house the next morning with 2 coffees and a forced smile. My mother opened the door, surprised. Claire? I've been thinking, I said, tone light, about what you said. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe it's time we find a middle ground. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. Inside, nothing had changed. The same cold decor, the same white walls devoid of warmth. My father was in his study, reading legal briefs, pretending not to notice me. I handed him a coffee. I know the house is sold, I began carefully, but I thought maybe I could help you with some of the paperwork before you move on. You always said I was good at the fine print. Charles narrowed his eyes. Why? Because despite everything, I'm still your daughter. That seemed to satisfy them for now. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I listened to their complaints about renovations, about taxes, about the new buyer, me in disguise. I pretended to be neutral, even sympathetic, but I was digging. On the 3rd day, while helping my mother organise old financial statements, I found it. A faded folder stuffed behind gardening invoices. Inside was a notarised form dated 2 years ago, transferring a savings account from Evelyn's name to Charles Mitchell's. It was signed with consent. But the handwriting was clumsy, childlike, clearly not Evelyn's. And worse, the notary listed had died the year before the form was supposedly filed. Forgery. I took a photo. That night I met with Harold again, the old lawyer who had helped set up the trust. This is gold, he said. It shows a pattern, financial manipulation, intent to defraud, abuse of power of attorney. We can go after them hard. I shook my head. Not yet. I want to end this without a courtroom, if I can. Quiet. Controlled. He gave me a long look, then nodded. You're more like your grandfather than you know. Armed with the new evidence, I paid a visit to the real estate broker who had facilitated the house transfer. A smug man in his 50s who clearly thought he'd pulled off the deal of a lifetime. Mr. Carver, I said, placing the forged document on his desk. This is a copy of a transfer your client used to validate his access to funds used in the transaction. He looked at it, then at me. I suggest you review your due diligence files, I continued, because if this hits the State Board, your licence could be suspended pending investigation. Fraud under your facilitation isn't a small charge. What do you want? He asked. Reverse the transfer, quietly, full refund, clean title. The house was never theirs to sell. His jaw tightened. You don't have the authority. The trust does, I said, sliding over a second folder. And the trust has deeper pockets than you realise. The cheque I used was from the interest earned by Grandpa's original accounts, restored legally once we exposed the signature discrepancies. His money returned for his home, full circle. The broker gave in. 2 days later, I stood beside Evelyn in the county office as the deed was signed over. Not to the trust, not to me, but to her, quietly, cleanly. She looked at the paper for a long time, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. I don't understand, she whispered. It's yours, I said. It always was. She hugged me then, tighter than she had since I was a child. And I held her, saying nothing. I didn't tell her about the trust or the legal manoeuvres or the broker's panic. She didn't need the mess. She just needed her house. And I would carry the rest. The invitations were handwritten, just like Evelyn used to do for Sunday suppers. Dinner at Maple Street, 6 p.m, Wednesday. Bring nothing. I mailed them to my parents' office, not their home. They'd never open anything personal there, but legal-looking envelopes always caught their attention. That Wednesday evening, the house smelled of rosemary chicken and baked apples. I'd prepared everything myself, just like she taught me, though Evelyn now sat quietly on the porch, knitting something she refused to name. "You're sure about this?" I asked. She nodded, not looking up. "They need to see who they turned away." At 6 sharp, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. My mother stepped out first, heels clicking on the brick path, face unreadable. Charles followed, slightly slower, cautious. They hadn't been back since the sale, since I bought it back, since the house returned to the one person who truly loved it. They didn't know yet. "Claire," my father said with his lawyer's smile. "Smells impressive. Hosting suits you." I led them to the dining room. The table gleamed with polished silverware and linen napkins, but it was the envelope in the centre that drew their attention. My mother's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "Dessert," I said softly, "but open it now." She pulled the tab. Charles leaned over her shoulder, and together they unfolded the letter inside. A single sheet, no letterhead, just 3 clean lines, signed and notarized. This document confirms that Charles and Margaret Mitchell are no longer permitted on the premises of 18 Maple Street, under penalty of trespassing, effective immediately. Charles's face flushed deep crimson. My mother's lips thinned to a single furious line. "What kind of joke is this?" she hissed. I stayed seated. "It's not a joke. The house belongs to Evelyn. The trust has relinquished ownership. It's her name on the deed now." "You tricked us," Charles growled, "manipulated the transaction. You forged her signature, transferred her savings, illegally evicted her. Let's not pretend anyone here took the high road." My mother's voice was sharp as broken glass. "You did this to humiliate us." "No," I said. "I did it to protect her, to fix what you broke." Charles slammed his palm on the table. "You're ungrateful after everything we did for you." "Everything you did was for yourselves," I cut in. "You took her house, her money, her dignity, and now you're mad you don't get to keep the spoils." The room pulsed with silence. Then Evelyn entered. She didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, her hands clasped. Finally, she said, "I made you both dinner. One last time. Not for reconciliation, for closure." My mother stared. "You expect us to eat? After this circus?" Evelyn's voice didn't shake. "I expect nothing. That's the difference between you and me. I don't need to win. I only need peace." She turned and walked into the kitchen, slow but steady. I met their eyes. "You're free to finish your meal. But after tonight, don't come back. Not without her invitation," Charles scoffed. "You'll regret this." "I already did, for 36 years. They didn't eat, just left the house like it was poison. Evelyn didn't ask what they said. She didn't need to. She sat down at the table, unfolded her napkin, and began to eat. Quietly, with dignity. And I sat with her for the first peaceful meal in years, where the only sound was silver on porcelain and the slow, steady unravelling of a decades-long war. After they left, the silence hung like thick velvet. I stood for a moment in the doorway, watching the black sedan vanish down the street, its tail lights swallowed by dusk. Then I turned back inside and closed the door, slowly, like sealing a vault. Evelyn was already in the dining room, cutting her roast chicken with surgical precision. Her plate was arranged like a memory, neat, quiet, dignified. "Mind if I put on music?" I asked. She didn't look up. "As long as it's not modern noise." I smiled and crossed the room to the old turntable tucked into the corner cabinet. I thumbed through the vinyl collection she'd kept all these years. Jazz, soul, and tucked in the very back, one of Grandpa's favourites, Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Cole Porter Songbook. The soft crackle of the record began before the first notes even played. Then came the slow swing of Every Time We Say Goodbye. Evelyn didn't say anything, but her fork paused mid-air. "I thought he'd like that," I said. She nodded. "He would have..." We ate in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need patching up. The music filled the spaces words couldn't. When we finished, she stood, moved slowly to the sideboard, and opened a drawer I hadn't noticed before. From it, she pulled a thin manila envelope. No markings, just my name in her elegant cursive. She handed it to me without ceremony. "What is this?" "Your inheritance," she said. I stared at her, confused. "I thought the house..." "Was mine to give," she interrupted softly, "and now it's yours." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were legal transfer documents, signed, notarized. She had transferred the deed to the house, to me. "Evelyn, why?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Because you earned it. Because you held space for me when no one else did. Because you didn't just defend me, you saw me." I felt the tears building but blinked them back. "You didn't have to do this." "No," she said, smiling slightly. "But for the first time in my life, I wanted to." I folded the papers carefully, reverently, and placed them back inside. The weight of that moment settled into my chest like warmth. And then the doorbell rang. I turned toward it, surprised. Evelyn didn't move. I opened it. My mother stood on the porch, not angry, not proud, not calculating, just raw. "Claire," she said, voice trembling, "please don't do this. Don't let her turn you against us." I looked at her face. The woman who had shaped me with cold hands and sharp rules, who taught me perfection mattered more than peace, who once told me emotion was weakness. Now here she was, begging. "You raised me to be strong," I said, "to win, to take control. You just never expected it would be over you." She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. "You taught me this cruelty," I whispered. "And now you're asking me to unlearn it for your comfort." Her eyes filled, but she didn't speak. "You made your choices," I said. And now I'm making mine. I closed the door, this time softly. Evelyn hadn't moved. She was standing by the window, watching the reflection of the room instead of the street. Do you regret it? I asked. No, she said. Because for once, we wrote the ending. It began with a summons, delivered not by mail but by courier, hand-delivered to the front gate. Claire Mitchell versus Charles and Margaret Mitchell. The names looked like they belonged to strangers. The allegations were simple. Unlawful coercion, emotional duress, fraudulent acquisition of estate property. In plain terms, my parents were accusing me of manipulating Evelyn into signing over the house, and through that, her remaining financial assets. They were suing me for everything. Evelyn read the letter in silence, then folded it precisely and tucked it into her desk drawer beside a dried sprig of lavender. They think they can still control the narrative, she said. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. They'll spin it like I exploited you. They've always been better at fiction than family. The trial was set for mid-July, civil court, local jurisdiction. But the attention it drew turned the case into a spotlight. The Mitchell name had weight. My mother saw to that. She leaked her own statement to the press 2 weeks before the hearing. An elder woman betrayed by the granddaughter she trusted most, signatures manipulated, decisions clouded by old age. They framed Evelyn as a victim of my ambition. It would have worked. If not for the paper trail, Hartman was ruthless. At the hearing, he produced documents signed years earlier, Evelyn's health records, showing mental clarity beyond reproach. He showed recordings of her own statements confirming intent. More damning, he pulled up financial transfers from their accounts, money moved without Evelyn's consent, timed with suspicious medical authorizations my mother had signed as her proxy. That's when the judge's tone shifted. This isn't a question of elder abuse, she said. It's a case study in projection. My father tried to speak, calmly at first, then louder. The judge shut him down. Margaret wept. I sat still, flanked by Hartman and Evelyn, who never looked away from the bench. Then the final blow landed. Evelyn herself stood to speak. Her voice didn't tremble. I was not coerced, she said. I was not confused. I was liberated. She turned to my parents. For decades, you twisted the truth to fit your comfort. You controlled property, people, perception. Claire didn't break this family. She's the first one who refused to lie for it. The courtroom was dead quiet. The ruling came 2 days later. My parents lost. The house was confirmed legally and irrevocably mine. Their countersuit was dismissed with prejudice. Worse, assets tied to their misuse of Evelyn's accounts were frozen. A formal investigation opened into years of quiet financial abuse. They left the courthouse in silence, cameras flashing, reporters shouting. I didn't follow them. I stood on the steps, Evelyn beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. They'll say we destroyed them, I said. She shook her head. They destroyed themselves. We just stopped hiding it. For the first time in months, I exhaled. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Just when we thought the dust had settled, the real storm began. A week after the verdict, Hartman received a call from a woman identifying herself as a former bank secretary. Her voice was cautious but firm. I have something your client needs to hear, she said. We met her at his office. She looked nervous, a thin woman in her 50s with weathered hands and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. I worked at Sterling Bank for 17 years, she said. Margaret Mitchell was a regular client, very precise, very demanding. She opened her purse and slid a folder across the table. I kept records of all client interactions, even the ones we weren't supposed to, especially those. Inside were time-stamped log entries, authorization slips, security footage stills, and a hand-scrawled note attached to one slip. Client Evelyn Harris appeared sedated, requested to sign financial transfer. Guardian present, Margaret Mitchell. Refused to confirm consent. Action taken under pressure. Hartman exhaled sharply. You're saying she had Evelyn drugged? The woman nodded. I don't know what was in the tea she gave her, but she wasn't herself. We all saw it. But Margaret was persuasive. This wasn't just civil anymore. It was criminal. Hartman filed the report immediately. The district attorney's office opened an investigation within 72 hours. Margaret and Charles Mitchell were summoned again. This time not to defend an inheritance, but to face allegations of forgery, elder abuse, and coercion under sedation. The media caught fire. Old acquaintances vanished overnight. Friends turned silent. Colleagues issued public statements distancing themselves from the Mitchells. Speaking engagements were cancelled. Retirement fund boards revoked honorary titles. The legacy they'd curated so carefully began to unravel thread by thread. I watched it all quietly. Did I feel vindicated? No, just numb. On the day of the arraignment hearing, I stood outside the courthouse, flanked by cameras. A young journalist stepped forward, mic extended. Ms. Mitchell, she said, do you have a statement? I hesitated. So many words wanted to claw their way out about betrayal, pain, injustice. But I kept it simple. Justice isn't revenge, I said. It's repair. That was all, and it was enough. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came gently, like an apology whispered through the wind. The estate's gardens, long, neglected and overrun, finally began to stir again. I spent my mornings with gloves on, knees in the dirt, pulling out weeds that had claimed what once bloomed. Grandma Rose had loved this garden. She used to say plants don't ask for permission, they just grow. I thought about that every time I dug my fingers into the soil. The roses were the first to return, then the lavender, then the bees. I didn't hire landscapers. I didn't draw up plans. I just listened to the ground, to the trees, to the rhythm of light and water. Some days the silence felt louder than before, but now it held something different, an invitation, not an absence. Claire visited often. She'd always been the pragmatic one between us, me the fire, her the calm. She brought clippings from her garden, homemade sourdough, and updates on her latest project, a community centre and therapy office right in the heart of our hometown. She called it Open Light. You should come see it, she said one afternoon as we sat on the porch, both sipping iced tea. We're painting the front this weekend. Yellow, I guessed, she smiled. Of course, it had always been her colour, bright, brave. Later that week, I did visit. And standing outside that little converted house with its cheerful shutters and a hand-painted sign above the door, I felt something unexpected press against my ribs. Hope. Claire had hired mostly local women. Former caregivers, retired teachers, one woman who used to run the floral shop, and now taught trauma-informed gardening workshops. The waiting room smelled like lemon oil and fresh books. This is what healing looks like, Claire said as she gave me the tour. It didn't smell like legacy, it smelled like home. Back at the estate, I kept things small. I didn't host parties, I hosted potlucks. The neighbours brought pies and pickles. Someone brought their guitar. One woman brought her daughter who had just aged out of foster care and was looking for a quiet job and a place to feel seen. I hired her the next morning. In time, the house didn't feel quite so large. It felt full. Not of people, but of purpose. I still sat on the porch each morning, the same chair, the same east-facing view, but now there was a second chair beside mine, not always filled, but ready, waiting, because I'd stopped needing to be invited. Now I was the one holding the door, and the light, it stayed on. Claire found it while cleaning out an old chest in the attic of the estate, one I hadn't touched since inheriting the house. It was tucked beneath faded quilts and tax records, inside a small wooden box sealed with a rusted clasp. A cassette tape, labelled in our grandfather's handwriting, for Rose, if anything happens. We found an old recorder in the study. Claire dusted it off and slid the tape inside. The machine clicked, whirred, then hissed with static. And then his voice filled the room, weak, raspy, but unmistakably his. "If you're hearing this," he began, "I didn't get to say goodbye. I'm sorry." Claire and I froze. "I always feared," he continued, "that they'd erase her. Evelyn. They never knew what to do with her strength. It frightened them." I felt the sting in my chest rise. Claire reached over and held my hand. "I made mistakes," he whispered. "I tried to fix things in silence. But I hoped, God, I hoped you'd remember, that someone would." The tape ended there. No legal claims, no declarations, just a grandfather whispering hope into the dark. Claire turned off the recorder and wiped her cheeks. "He saw you," she said softly, "even then." We sat in silence for a long time. That night, I wrote the charter for a new scholarship fund, Claire's Cornerstone, a grant for young women in trades, construction, architecture, civil engineering, girls like me who loved blueprints more than ball gowns. Girls who didn't fit the mould. When I told Claire, she didn't cry. She just nodded. "You always were the builder," she said. "Now you're building futures." The fund launched within 6 weeks. And for the first time, the family name wasn't front and centre. Hers was, because she'd remembered, because she never stopped holding space for me when no one else did. Now I'd hold space for someone else. Each evening, as the sky darkened and the hills turned gold, I walked out to the porch and flipped the switch on the front light. A small ritual, quiet, steady, it was something Grandpa used to do. No matter what time Claire and I came home, after study sessions or heartbreaks or snowstorms, that porch light was always glowing, a silent message. You're not alone, you are seen. Now it was my turn. I never missed a night, not because I expected someone to come, but because someone might, and the light would be waiting,